Hello，大家，我是 Alex English 殷亚东老师，我来自美国，我已经在中国有18年，我是在中国读了博士，然后在中国工作，我是在温州可能大学副教授，我们是一个中美合作大学，我研究的是跨文化适应，我主要的研究话题是海归人才适应，还有外籍人才适应。之前我是做流水生适应问题哦，还有一个可能比较有意思的事情是，我有中国永久居留证，这个绿卡在国内是非常难拿到，基本上是1%的外国人有这个卡。我现在刚好是在我旁边，我给你卡这个卡。对，这个也是比较有意思的一个大事，对我来说就说明我可以一直在中国。谢谢大家，很高兴认识你们。
Hi, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the new episode of Culture and Conversation, where we discuss how culture is experienced in everyday life. My name is Chuan Hong. I'm the host of this podcast, and today I'm very pleased to have Dr. Alex English to be on my show. And Alex is an associate professor of psychology at the Wenzhou-Kean University in China. He's also the executive director for the Center for Behavioral Research Across Cultures and the associate editor for the International Journal of Intercultural Relations. Alex, welcome to the show.
Hi, hello, thanks for having me.
Hey, great. Thank you so much, Alex. I read up a bit about your work and I saw your profile. You're amazing. And you introduce yourself, in Mandarin, to talk about a bit about your background. So I want to begin by asking you about, the kind of work that you do and also how that aligns with, China's transformation in the last 20 years. So you studied cross-cultural adaptation, but at the same time, of course, you also experienced it yourself, given that you work and live in China for the last 2 decades. So looking back, do you think some of the social and psychological barriers, what do you think are some of the social and psychological barriers facing expatriates and international students in China? And how has it changed, in the last 20 years? And what would you advise, more importantly, what would you advise to those who intend or plan to work and live, in China today?
Wow, thank you for this question. It's quite big, and as we know, China is quite a big culture and context, and it has become a very important one in the last 20 years. So I came to China in 2007, and the whole plan was just to stay for a year. I said I'll give it a year, and I just wanted to learn Mandarin because I had lived abroad somewhere else, and I was just curious about what another language would do in terms of like learning and if I could master it. And then I fell in love with China. Like 1 year became 2 years, and it became 5 years, and then I decided, you know what, all these Chinese people are going abroad to study and do their PhD, a master's degree. Why aren't they studying in China? Why wouldn't I just stay here and do my PhD? And so I enrolled in a PhD program in China. And of course, I wanted to do it in Chinese. I wanted to challenge myself above and beyond just a regular old PhD in English. So that's what kept me here in terms of my studying. And then I knew that I wanted to do cross-cultural adaptation because I had lived abroad in Chile when I was an undergrad, and I experienced the whole experience of acculturation and reverse culture shock. And I was prepared for the whole process of like going to live abroad. But what was the hardest part was coming home.
Coming home.
I grew so much as a person as an undergrad in my third year, my junior year, and I was so unaware what was going to happen, and it hit me like a big rock. And I knew that at that point, like when I did my PhD, that I wanted to keep learning about this process and understand it more intricately. And specifically, I wanted to help international students because I had already lived in China for 5 years. I felt pretty good about the Chinese culture. And so my undergrad or my PhD was mainly about adaptation for international students. And so that's what, got me my PhD and got me through. And then during that whole process, I met my wife, and then I decided to move to Shanghai, and we got together and we got married. And then I was working with Steve Coolidge, and he was doing a lot of cross-cultural training. And that's when I really discovered that this is really cool, like coaching, helping expats, because they're experiencing something very different from a student. And then I started getting into the coaching, and I've been coaching for maybe 10 years now. And I do coaching for big companies, big 500, Fortune 500 companies. I have one tomorrow. And so I help these expats on moving to China, living in China well, and then succeeding in the workplace. So yeah, that's just a little bit about my background. And in terms of like what's been going on here is the change is immense. Like all of the, you can't describe it in one word or in one sentence. But I could say there are a lot of positive things in terms of like for living in China, it's much easier, it's more convenient. Translation and phones have made our lives much better. But at the same time, I still feel there's this separation from the foreign bubble, international student bubble, expat bubble, and the locals. And I always try to challenge when I'm coaching expats and also students, like, hey, how can you break that barrier? How can you, integrate a little bit more and become more closer to what locals live or how they're getting along? And so I really strive to do that. So yeah, the whole challenge for expats is very different from when I first got here, but there are still a number of difficulties. I'm happy to go more into depth if you would prefer.
I mean, that sounds really awesome, right? I mean, the fact that you go through that whole transformation yourself, and then you studied those transformation.
Right.
But again, clearly things in China evolve very rapidly. And those experiences, some of them would have been different, from the time that you were there. I look at some of your studies and I think one particular area that struck me, because you talk about your research on the adaptation of the overseas returnees, or in what China they call the haigui, which is the sea turtle. And you have a very interesting background because you said that you were in China, you immersed in China for so long, and then when you went back to the US, you had this reverse culture shock. And then at the same time, you're also looking at the Chinese students and try to understand the reverse culture shocks that these Chinese students have to put up with, when they return home. So, in your opinion, what are some of the main barriers, emotional, psychological, intergroup barriers that this particular segment of Chinese students, the Chinese returnees, what do they encounter? What are some of the biggest difficulties, and how is that different from the context elsewhere? For instance, returnees back to China, not China, but Japan, Korea, or in Southeast Asia. What are some of your insights on that?
Yeah. So luckily, I got a really good grant to do a study on this because the number of haigui has been increasing so much. And I think after COVID, there was this huge shift where they began to realize that, oh, I can stay abroad and do well and strive. But if I come back to China, I can challenge myself. I can push myself to the limits and maybe I can succeed. Maybe I can do well. But at the same time, they've been coming to a society that is super, we call it Dren, very, the rat race, we would say, ultra competitive, super high pressure. And the challenges for haigui is that they've been educated outside and they've had this experience of being removed from the Tizhine within China, this system that's built within China. And then they try to come back and they bring tons of skill. They're super intelligent. But there's one aspect of Chinese culture that they're hindered with, which is guanxi or network. The academic network within China is very important, it's very much built on who you know, who your supervisor knows, how well you're connected. And so one of the biggest challenges for them is they come back and they realize, whoa, I'm doing really well, I'm super capable, but I'm missing the resources, I'm missing those social connections that someone who had done their PhD in China, who had been living in China for all these years, have now maybe surpassed them in a way. That is not to say that the haigui don't succeed. It's just an extra barrier that they probably weren't ready for. And they're also so adapt or acculturated outside in terms of how they deal with supervisors, how they deal with the interpersonal relations. And then they come back and they realize the hierarchy, the differences in terms of like, I'm now a professor, I have students. students in Confucian societies look up to professors, but in Western contexts or in non-Western, not in China, there's more of a flat culture. You can call your professor by the first name. In China, you don't do that, right? You go in and you call them professor or 老师, and you show utmost respect. So these sort of structural hierarchical factors really play into their challenges. So we've been running this study where we've been looking at the Haigui and the returnees and comparing them to international talent. We call them foreign talent. And we've been looking at how well they're adapting. And also we've been taking hair samples to measure cortisol. And cortisol is
hair samples. Wow.
Yeah. So it's an objective measure of stress, right? So we can ask you how stressed you are, and you may say, "Oh, I'm not stressed at all." But we can cut your hair, or we can collect saliva samples, and that's an acute measure of your cortisol.
Yeah.
And when we compare the differences, we find that the Haigui are actually way more stressed than the foreigners. But when we look at the self-reported measures, there's no statistical difference. It's like the Haiguis are not willing to accept that they're stressed, or their physiologically body is telling them that they're more stressed than they're showing in a self-reported questionnaire. So we've been doing this study for 2 years. So we've collected 3 waves of hair cortisol samples, and it's just incredible to see these individuals and how well they're doing, but also how much challenge they're experiencing, because tenure track and the system of like publish or perish is alive and well in China. And unfortunately, in the last few years, there's been a number of young Chinese scholars who have passed away or have lost their lives due to cancer, due to sudden illness, lack of sleep, because the work pressure is so immense. So I really hope that my study in the coming years, I could shed light at like different markers so we can help them, because after each of the waves, we give them a profile and we say, okay, this is your health. This is where you are. This is where you compare to other Haigui. This is where you compare to other foreigners. So we suggest you sleep more. We suggest you work less, take breaks. And so people have actually really commented on this. Is like, whoa, this is like really good for me to know. Is like, I'm working too much, and I can see it compared to other Haigui. So yeah. So this study has been ongoing, and hopefully we'll have some papers to come out more to support what I'm telling you today.
Well, I hope you publish a paper not in oceanology or sea ecology, but certainly this is about human behaviors. I kind of forgot that for the benefit of audience who are not familiar with the term Haigui, would you like to tell us a little bit about why we named this after a sea turtle? In this particular case of the overseas returnees.
Yeah, so actually I'm not so familiar with why Haigui, but what it means is it sounds like you're returning home, so it kind of has like a double meaning. Hai means like sea, and then Gui is like a turtle. And so these turtles have gone out into the sea, and there's always been this in Chinese culture. I'm not an expert in history and all this, but there's always been this fascination with like going out to sea and returning home, and always been about like learning from the West or learning from outside and then bringing it back to China. And so this new group of people, and it's a massive group, it's like millions every year that are going abroad and coming back. And the whole traditional idea is like, you're bringing back for the society, you're going to contribute for the organization. And, this was big in 2010, 15, 20, pre-COVID. It was like, you're Haigui, well, you're like super prestigious or elite. But after COVID, there's just so many that Haigui they've lost their status in prestige, but they're still really important in society. Like Chinese people really appreciate you've been Western or educated outside of China.
I figured that maybe one of the reasons why they call this a sea turtle is because the sea turtles always go back to where they came from to lay the eggs. Maybe. So it's okay. I think the audience can leave the comments in the comment box below and tell us why we call this Haigui. I want to kind of repivot some of the couple of questions back to your own experience, as an expatriate living in China, and I'm just curious how much of your experience as an expatriate influenced the way you frame the research questions and the topics that you choose to study. And more importantly, how do you kind of balance that personal insight with the scientific objectivity, that you tend to gather? And more importantly, too, if I may be more pointed in terms of the experience, now how does being a white expatriate in China means to you? Because we oftentimes hear about, some of them call it the Pinkerton syndrome, if you like. The white expats tend to have an easier time, or tend to be given the benefit of the doubt, adjusting in Asian society. So, what are some of your thoughts on that?
Gosh, three big questions. Let me try to tackle them one by one. So yeah, I would say like being a foreigner in China, and I guess I was so lucky to come here early and to get like a good base of Mandarin before I started studying, because like those 5 years when I was still like I was doing like work, I was working in international school, and I was just learning Chinese culture, and I wasn't really sure if I wanted to do my PhD. But that like really gave me a lot of insight into Chinese society. And I lived in Shenzhen, which is near Hong Kong. And Shenzhen is a city of only 35 years, 40 years now. And so there, it's a migrant city. And so every time I would meet someone, they were not from Shenzhen. So they were an internal migrant, right? They were moving to Shenzhen, and they were starting their life there. And they were also transitioning to the society, like to Shenzhen as well. So I started hearing all these accents. I started to learn about the diversity of Chinese culture. And that was one thing that is so misunderstood, is that China is not one. I mean, it is one culture and very important culture, but there's so many regional differences. And when I was in Shenzhen, I would hear it, I would see it, I would feel it, like with how I would talk to people. And so that really gave me insight when I started studying, is to start thinking about China in terms of like regional differences, and like what's really explaining these differences between the North and the South, the West and the East, all the variation within China. And so that being a foreigner gave me that like bird's eye view of the society, because I wasn't like so integrated. I'm a foreigner. I'm always going to be an outsider. I'm a white guy. I'm never going to be able to be fully integrated. So I was always, just there, just sort of observing, having that eye and ear into the field, into the environment. And that played out in so many areas of my research. Like when COVID hit, I was observing the mask use. And so like I was really right on the ground to know like masks are going to be a big thing. Why are people in China wearing masks? Why aren't they being accepted in the West? All those types of questions that we were later wondering about, like I was already like thinking about. And then more recently with the youth in China, which I think we'll talk about more, is like how difficult their life has been after COVID, because they grew up in a China that was always improving. Housing prices are always going up. It will never go down. And I kept wondering, I'm like, really, will it ever come down? And then sadly, these last few years, it's been very hard for them. So we've been running this study about the youth in China, which I'll talk about. So I think it's just being the outsider has given me that ability to like, the acute ability to like think like what might be coming or what's going on. And I don't think I would have that if I was just like an American in America. So I think, those experiences and the ways I've been thinking are very different. In terms of just being, we use the word 老外 or foreigner in China. So I think it's like a double-edged sword for white guys, because, we do have, that privilege perhaps. However, it's changed a lot in the last 15, 20 years that I've been living in China. There are times when I can get away with, I'm that foreigner and I did something stupid. But at other times I'm held at a certain like level that I wouldn't have been like 5 or 10 years ago. And then because I'm also from the US, it does add an extra level of complication where I do need to be careful. And also because my family, like I have a son who's half Chinese. And so I'm obviously very careful and very aware of my position, who I am, and always trying to think about it in a culturally sensitive way, understanding of Chinese culture, and very nuanced to not abuse or use it in a way that shouldn't be done. And that's one thing that I always tell the expats who move here is like, hey, we're foreigners. However, we do need to respect and appreciate and embrace Chinese culture as much as we can. And of course, there are certain things we can embrace, that's understandable for you, and there are those individual differences. So yeah, no, I think those are some important pieces that we might lose sight of, that some foreigners might lose sight of in China.
How much of an advantage have you got being white and at the same time able to speak Mandarin, able to converse in Chinese?
Wow. Yeah. So I mean, it really depends on the situation and the context. So I'm now at a university. Which we didn't talk about. I'm at a Sino-American university. So it's an American university in China. All of our curriculum is in English. We give grades and give diplomas like an American university. Before, right, I was at a very prestigious university in China, a local university. And during that time, I realized that there was no advantageous to being a foreigner. In fact, it was very hard for me because there were very few of us. Everything was in Chinese. Even though I'm fluent in Chinese, I could teach in Chinese. It was still, there were just so many hurdles that I couldn't break through as a foreigner, as an outsider, right? And I tried so hard, but it was just some of those things that was just very challenging. So it really depends on the context. I mean, going to buy groceries, I can always get a discount because I'll just throw in, oh, Tai Gui La, and they're like, whoa, you speak Chinese, and they give me like 1 RMB off. But those are the fun days.
I can imagine, yes. I mean, I kind of resonate with a lot of things that you mentioned, and of course there are different terms and some of them not so nice and a little bit derogatory, when they talk about the white or other racial groups. I mean, I look at your studies, and I mean, there was this interesting piece that you talked about a while ago, talking about the Chinese youth having a hard time securing jobs in today's context because of the very brutal rat race we have in China. And this is a part that I'm a little bit confused because, Alex, you hear a very different narrative. So on the one hand, you have the Chinese youth who are very, very cosmopolitan, very, very well-traveled, very savvy, technology savvy, able to apply AI and tech, and be able to amplify the work that they do. But at the same time, you also hear a lot of stories about the Chinese youth lying flat or bailan, right, which translates to basically not working or letting it rot. They're kind of resigned to a system that they believe would never enable them to move up the socio-economic ladder. So, I mean, how would you describe this generation of young Chinese workers or young Chinese adults in terms of their career development, transition, mobility, and what kind of emotional and psychological profile, when they come to relating to what the new economic environment will be like, and of course being Chinese, culturally Chinese, but pretty much competing, like all other people from the US or from Europe, and being a part of this new Gen Z, if you like. I mean, what are your views of this, this profile, this generational profile of young Chinese adults?
Yeah, so it again, this is a whole foresight because we've been studying this since 2022, which was when the Shanghai lockdown just ended. I had two master's students who were like really interested in the topic because they're about to graduate and they're like, teacher, I don't know what I'm going to do. I don't have a job. And all of my life, I knew I would be in a good position because I was getting an undergrad degree. I was getting a master's degree and I would have a job. But now I don't know what's going to be out there. And it's, oh my gosh, we really need to study this. So we've been running a longitudinal study tracking 500 emerging adults. They're now 25, 26 years old. Every 3 to 5 months, we send out a survey. So we've just finished wave 15 from this data collection. And so I would just say, I really feel very sad for this group because, as I mentioned earlier, they grew up in a China that was always growth. GDP, 10%, 8%, housing prices doubling, tripling. And then there was also this big movement when they were probably in middle school or high school called the China Dream, which was like entrepreneur, make it big, no matter what, you're going to have money. And then when they hit college, COVID hits, their whole college experience is in lockdown. I don't need to talk too much, but COVID in China was very hard. And then they graduate and that's it. So it's just like this big flat drop for them. And it's been 4 years. So, this group has experienced a lot and it's been tough for them. I always tell my students, because they're very, in some ways, they can be pessimistic. I almost feel like there's two groups. There's like the overachievers, super motivated, and they're willing to do whatever it takes. And then there's also the ones that are experiencing this lying flat, or they just kind of like, just don't want to do much or give it a shot. And I feel for both, right? Because it is this huge challenge that they're experiencing, because it's not only from the school, it's also from their parents, it's from their grandparents, it's also from their classmates, because this rat race, this brutal rat race is societal, it's systemic. It's at one point, it could be your classmate that's pushing you. At another point, it could be the teacher or your parents. And so it's just this continual cycle that is viciously tearing them apart. And some of them have the ability to like fight back and use good coping and like overcome it and like, turn it into something good, being positive and use it as a growth mindset. But others struggle and they then just come to it and they just realize that they can't do it. So we ran this really cool study where we interviewed 20 emerging adults who had just, they had been working for 6 months. 10 of them had continued working. So they've been working well and thriving at work. And 10 of them had quit. And we interviewed them and we're asking about like, what are your reasons? What's going on? What's driving you? And a lot of them talked about many personal things like, the job is not what I wanted. I was, working as my major was, in tech. And now I'm an educator and this is not for me. It's like these sudden shifts cause them distress and struggle and they just gave up. So yeah, we identified these two groups and we realized that we just need to support them more. We need to provide them more support in terms of, we're doing this hope intervention where we're trying to help promote positive mindset and like goal setting orientated, hope oriented, like keeping your eye on the target type of way. And there is some benefit from it, but in terms of the job market, it's very unpredictable and very uncertain for everyone. So it's just one of those things that we're all experiencing.
It sounds a little bit like the uncertainty avoidance culture.
Yeah.
The fact that, you are actively or proactively avoiding, coping or dealing with some of the uncertainties in life and the challenges, by taking a path that is less trodden. I was just going to say one huge shift in the last 5 or 10 years is the idea of the Chinese dream entrepreneurial to 考研, which is civil servants. So everyone is going for this stable civil servant job, because apparently traditionally in China, it's a lifetime job. It's a 铁饭碗, right? An iron rice bowl job. So if you can become a civil servant, your life is set. It's not about making the most money. It's just about having stability, and that is security, and that's happiness for you and your family, which is what your parents want. It sounds like the old school 考状元. To become a scholar, and then you are part of the government, and then of course as an administrator, life is good.
Yeah. And stable, right? Yeah.
That's right. Yeah. I mean, talk about stability and that homogeneity. We talk about the Chinese, being more cosmopolitan and being exposed and having greater experiences, emerging in a different culture, study overseas, and of course they are part of the high-grade population. So, a lot of times you talk about Chinese society, we tend to conjure up an image that is relatively monocultural, right, in the in intercultural experience. And I'm just wondering, like, how would you describe Chinese youth in today's environment? Is it less of a monocultural society, but more of one that is emerging, that, they have greater cognizance of different cultural practices, different norms, different values, beyond China, or they are, are the Chinese youth today, still very much looking at, the cultural practices, mostly from a mostly ethnocentric point of view. I mean, what are your experience so far?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I would say Chinese youth they have had this special experience that is unique to other generations and other world groups, US specifically, I would say. Like, say they've seen this huge shift, and they've lived it, right? I would say they are agile, flexible, and they can jump quickly between traditional Chinese ways because that's like their education, like respect teacher, respect hierarchy, Confucian ways, but then they can shift right to this cosmopolitan way, maybe more individualistic thinking, independent, and that's like bicultural. So I don't know. I just feel like compared to other youths, I mean, I haven't had a lot of contact with U.S. youth much as I've been living in China, but I just can feel and know, especially because of their language. Chinese youth are pretty fluent in English for the most part, right? They've had more exposure to a second language than definitely Americans have to other languages, right? So that other culture really has helped them in terms of like their whole framing and their mindset. And they, it's almost like after college, they know when they go to work, they need to shift to the Confucian way because they're going to have a leader, they're going to be in a team, they're going to be young, they're going to have to look up to older sister, older brother, or Ling Dao, who's the boss, and have to show the respect again. But in college, they're still like flexible, free. They have their hair dyed. They're very dressed however they prefer and come to class, and they shift right back. So yeah, I would say that they're very agile. And I'm very curious what's going to happen more with AI. In some ways positive, and also in some ways a little worried, because it is making their future more uncertain. Maybe in a way, right? If they're relying too much on AI and depending on it too much without not thinking and using the brain, that's a big fear that I have for my students.
Right.
Yeah.
It's interesting you talk about that because in the earlier episodes, I have an interview with Ying Yi Hong, and she talked exactly about what you described, that dynamism, the cultural dynamism to shift, to adjust, and to adapt accordingly. And it seems like, what you described pretty much fits along that the contour of dynamic cultural relativism.
So I'll just give you an example at our school. I mean, we're American school, we're 300 foreign teachers, but we also have around 200 Chinese returnees. And these students can shift with a Chinese teacher to Chinese way, super respectful in Chinese. I'm over listening, super, like a Chinese way. And then to the foreign teacher using first name, more direct, more assertive, and immediately like going back and forth. And I'm like, man, these students are so flexible. It's amazing. And her work is perfect example. I mean, she's her work is great on this. So she knows.
Absolutely. We see a lot of the theories, or in fact, the frameworks, the research that we do, a lot of them are actually developed in the Western context, Alex, and yourself studying and living in China for the last 20 years. Which aspect of Chinese society, culture, or practices that you think has remained poorly understood by the foreign scholars? And what are some of those concepts that, in your opinion, require a complete new theoretical framework, a new theoretical approach, rather than to rely on the Western models? I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, this is a great question. So, I mean, I grew up in the south of the US, and I could say in my 20 years I've been in the south of China. So I've always been the southerner. And so, there's the research on the rice theory of culture, which is looking at rice, southern China versus the north, wheat farming. And I think that's done a really good job of challenging collectivism and our understanding of collectivism, because I still read it when I'm doing reviews and my students' papers. Is like collectivism, all the people in collectivist society, they're going to be friendly and they have warm feelings and are very friendly to neighbors and strangers. But we know that collectivist cultures and interdependent cultures are not that way, right? I mean, you're very close with your in-group. So I would say, yeah, especially in Confucian culture where family is important and, who is in your inner group is so important. So I would say that's really been misunderstood. I would also say that the theory of tightness, cultural tightness and cultural looseness, because the paper that looked at this actually within China had talked about and Michelle Gelfand also wrote a nice review of it in China, is that it's cultural tightness is not driven from within the society, but it's also the interplay with the institution. And in China, it's such a unique institution, top down, and they really have driven a lot of the tight cultures. Like economically advanced areas in China are more tight. But in Western or US states that are like, the East Coast and West Coast, those are more economically, higher in wealth and stuff. They're more loose, right? And so why is this? Because China has put so much emphasis on these areas along the coast in southern China to protect them and to make sure that their growth is sustainable and very much for the whole country. So I think like understanding these theories beyond the Western eye and our Western framing of our reading is very important. So that's why I really appreciate like indigenous psychology, especially in China, because it's like so unique, like, Wu Wei or, Taoism, and then also like the whole like 5 elements and how that could be very important in understanding Chinese people. So I've also been thinking about those research areas a little bit. Hopefully that's good for you to think about.
Well, fascinating, Alex. I mean, those things that you covered, indeed, you have to live it, to experience it in order to understand why is that different. Thank you so much, Alex, for just sharing. I think I'm sure a lot of audience will find your work fascinating. We'll check it out with you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. We look forward to having you again in the next episode.
Thank you. 喜欢做中国菜，每个礼拜我至少做5次中国菜5顿饭。我在这边，我认识我的爱人，我们有一个孩子，他是一个湖水孩子，他是在读2年级的公班，每天都要写很多汉字，还有做口算，每天给他辅导，对我来说是非常困难，因为他的数学已经超过我，他的汉字已经比我认识的多。谢谢大家，很高兴认识你们。